Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about World War One. So if you want to follow along, this is the World War One slideshow. It's pretty big, but World War One is kind of a big deal in American and world history. Before World War One, America will be an isolationist nation, and after World War One, America will be the preeminent world power. America will retreat back into isolationism, but then get dragged out of it completely during World War Two and after. Woodrow Wilson as president during World War One. He cast America's entry into the war in idealistic terms. He famously said the world must be made safe for democracy. This is a cornerstone of American foreign policy to this day, and to a greater or lesser extent, most American presidents are Wilsonian in that they make democracy a central component of foreign policy. World War One was fought from 1914 to 1918. It's fought all around the world. 70 million men mobilized for war, 10 million soldiers killed. That's about 6,000 a day. 6 million civilians killed, but to be fair, we don't really know how many were killed. Um, World War One is total war. It demands total mobilization of the armies, the economies, the societies, and the hearts and minds of the people in the countries. The outcome is either total victory or total defeat. Propaganda is a big part of World War One. We'll talk about that once we get to the American section of World War One. But governments are really trying to get their citizens to be behind the war effort completely. Totalitarianism is also an outcome of World War One. Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, a lot of the dictators we associate with World War Two kind of have their origins in World War One. World War One introduces the 20th century to mass genocide. There's the Armenian genocide, where maybe 500,000 to 2 million Armenians are killed by the Turks through execution, starvation, or forced relocation. There's a little bit of religious implications that the Armenians are Christians and the Turks are Muslims, but there's also the fact that the Armenians supported Russia because they have more in common with Russia than they do with the Ottoman Empire, even though the Armenians live in the Ottoman Empire. World War One produces the Russian Revolution of 1917, and we see the creation of the first communist state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And you could kind of argue that the Cold War, which we'll look at a lot later, also has its origins in World War One. That'll probably make more sense as we get there. Um, New kinds of words or uses come out of World War One for words. There's trenches, there's no man's land, there's the wristwatch. Gentlemen used to carry pocket watches, but when you go into battle, you can't run around with that thing jingling. The trench coat comes into fashion. Daylight savings time. So World War One really changes a lot. Excuse me. There's all kinds of new weapons, machine guns, artillery, poison gas, tanks, airplanes, submarines. There's even zeppelins. If you want to click on some of these links, you can kind of see some of the different weapons that were used, little YouTube clips about them. Um, the map of Europe is totally redrawn. If you look at slide 23, you can see Europe in 1914 and then Europe in the 1920s. The map of Europe totally changes because of World War One, and a lot of historians, and I tend to agree with them, they don't believe Hitler and World War Two would have been possible without World War One. Okay, I'm going to get into the causes of World War One, but basically what ends up happening is you kind of have a rise of militarism in Europe, you have an alliance system, you have nationalism, you have imperialism, and then you have the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's killed by Serbian nationalists. So basically, this starts off as a localized conflict between Austria and Serbia, and then Austria and Serbia's allies get into the war, and it basically spreads and gets bigger and bigger. If you look at slide 28, you can see that the Allied powers are England, France, and Russia for the most part, and Serbia. And then the Central powers are Germany, Austria Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria. Italy had been on the side of the Central powers, but then she switches and joins the Allies in return for a promise for territory after the war. And basically, if you look at slide 29, this is kind of how World War One starts. Uh, Serbia and Austria have a tussle. Russia is the big brother of Serbia. So Russia tells Austria, hey, don't mess around with Serbia. We're here to protect them. Well, Germany is supposed to protect Austria. So Germany tells Russia, hey, don't you pick on Austria. We have to defend them. And then France says to Germany, hey, don't pick on Russia. We have an alliance with Russia. And then Germany basically goes to war against France and Russia. The best way to invade France is through Belgium. So there's this thing called the Schlieffen Plan. If you look at slide 30 and 31, you can kind of see it. Basically, what ends up happening is the quickest way to get to France is through Belgium. And here's what the Germans decide to do. Let me backtrack. If you look at slide 30, basically Germany has France and Russia as enemies. So Germany has to split her army two directions. France is a small country geographically, and they're more advanced than Russia. Russia's backwards, doesn't have many trains or railroad tracks, and is geographically huge. France can get into the fight right away. Russia takes a long time. Russia's kind of compared to a steamroller, very powerful but very slow to get moving. So basically, Germany says we have something like 42 days to defeat France, and then by the 42nd or 43rd day, Russia will be ready to attack. So let's defeat France quickly, and then we'll turn our attention to Russia. Well, if you want to defeat France quickly, you have to go through Belgium. So that's what the Schlieffen Plan was all about. So I've got some maps on here. It's not important for American history, but I kind of just want to tell a little bit of the story. Because the Germans go through Belgium, they attack a neutral country. England gets involved in the war because they guaranteed Belgium's sovereignty. So when Germany invades, England has to go to war. And basically, what happens is it's all about speed for the Germans. Some of the Belgian citizens, some French soldiers in Belgium, resist. So basically, if the Germans move in a village and they get resistance, sometimes they might execute half of the village to kind of show, hey, don't slow us down. Basically, the Germans are pretty rough on Belgium. So there's this thing known as the Rape of Belgium. Basically, there's atrocities committed against civilians. There's old universities and churches burned. Basically, the Germans kind of have a heavy hand as they march through Belgium. And this is, America, who's neutral, doesn't really have a side. America kind of sees this and says, whoa, Germany, you're getting out of hand. So there's American journalists. If you look at slide 36, Richard Harding Davis, he was also a prominent journalist during the time of the Spanish-American War. I think I shared some of his writings earlier. He goes to Europe and he kind of gets America to realize that Germany is the aggressor nation. Edith Wharton also goes there. She's a famous novelist. She basically says that Germany is behaving with a hard hand. So a lot of Americans, even though we're neutral, kind of tend to see the British and French point of view because Germany seems kind of barbaric. To be sure, there's atrocities all over the place, but that's not always how it gets portrayed. Basically, the Germans get really close to Paris. There's a great battle outside of Paris called the Battle of the Marne. I'm on slide 46. Just as Paris is about to be captured, the British and the French push back the Germans and save Paris. And there's basically this race to the sea. So if you look at slide 48, you've got the armies right outside of Paris, and all of a sudden they start marching to the English Channel, to the sea. And this is kind of where trench warfare starts to set in. The armies are trying to get around each other. That's kind of how my arrows are going. But they can't get around each other, so you have trench warfare. The first few months, if you look at slide 50, huge amounts of losses. Like previous wars in Europe, this might be what the whole war would cost, but now you have millions of men being killed in the first, 4 to 6 months. It's just a terrible cost. The first couple of months is really quick, but then trench warfare sets in, and basically the lines don't really ever move after that because everyone's so well dug in. And you've got rifles that can shoot 1,000 yards. You've got machine guns. You've got artillery. It's very hard to attack and take your enemy's trenches. Sorry, I keep having to hiccup and burp. Okay, so Europe's fighting America. What do they have to do with World War I? Well, there's not really any vital interests for America picking a side. America has good economic relationships with the Allies and the Central Powers. America has a history of staying out of Europe's messes. And many Americans are immigrants from the countries now fighting. So there's tons of people over here. There's millions of people, the Germans, the Irish, who are cheering for the Central Powers. There's millions of immigrants, you know, French immigrants, English immigrants, Russian immigrants that are cheering for Russia. So America is kind of a divided country, and Woodrow Wilson knows he's got to walk a tightrope because of this. So early on, America's neutral. There's a song on slide 53 I'd like you to listen to. This is kind of an anti-war song about staying out of America, keeping America out of war. Tons of people in American politics want us to stay out of war. The people on slide 54, Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, Robert La Follette, Eugene Debs, and others. Across the whole political spectrum, a lot of people say that this war has nothing to do with America. And Wilson said, it would be a calamity for the world at large if we should all be drawn actively into this conflict and so deprived of all disinterested influence over the settlement. Americans must be neutral in fact as well as in name. We must be impartial in thought as well as in action. The people of the United States are drawn from many nations, and chiefly the nations now at war. Some will wish one nation, others another, to succeed in the momentous struggle. So basically, that's what Wilson says at the beginning of the war. So he kind of says, be neutral in thought as well as in action. Colonel Edward House, who was a big advisor to Wilson, he said, Germany's success would ultimately mean trouble for us. We'll have to abandon the path that you are blazing as a standard for future generations with permanent peace as its goal and a new international ethical code as its guiding star, and instead build up a military machine of vast proportions. So even though America is neutral, America leans towards the Allies. English is even if it's not legally the official language, English is officially, for all practical purposes, the language of America. The culture of America, the history of America is more closely aligned with the Allies than the Central Powers. And a lot of Wilson's advisors are pro-British. William Gibbs McAdoo, which was Wilson's Secretary of Treasury and his son-in-law, he said, Great Britain has always and will be our best customer. The high prices for food production have brought great prosperity to our farmers, while the purchases of war munitions have stimulated war industries and have set factories to full capacity. Great prosperity is coming. It is a large measure already here. It will be tremendously increased if we can extend reasonable credits to our customers. So basically, the American economy takes off. The government encourages more people to go farm. That's important to remember later on. American bankers give loans to the Allies. It's important that the Allies win because if the Allies lose, they won't be able to pay us back, but if they win, they probably will. And manufacturing booms because we make weapons for Europe. Now, here's kind of how America gets dragged into the war later on. I'm on slide 59 right now. Britain and Germany blockade each other. But here's the issue. Look at the two ships on the left of slide 59. The British have these big battleships that sit above water. When a ship from America comes to Europe, and maybe that ship's going to trade with England, maybe it's going to trade with Germany, that British battleship or destroyer can point its guns at that ship, that merchant ship, and say, we're going to inspect you for contraband of war, and let's say they find it on there. They let the civilians get off the ship. They either sink the ship or take the ship to England. If you're a German submarine and you do the same thing, you surface, a lot of these merchant ships have a deck gun. One hit from a deck gun will sink a submarine. One hit from a deck gun to a battleship or a destroyer or a dreadnought, that'll just seem like you're getting bit by a fly, no big deal. So German submarines can't give advance warning of attacking a ship. They can't take civilians on because they've already got limited room. So a lot of times Germans have to sink shipping, whereas the British can get the survivors off and take them home and kind of confiscate their ships. If you look at slide 60, those are kind of maps of the blockade. If you look at slide 61, there's a little YouTube clip of a Q ship. Those were merchant ships. The British put a secret deck gun on. The gun would be under the deck, and you could basically hoist it up all of a sudden in a matter of seconds, and it would be ready to fire. So even if the Germans look at you and you don't look like you have a gun on deck, there's secretly one below. So what ends up happening is the Germans start sinking ships. The most famous example is the Lusitania. In May of 1915, the ship is traveling from America to Great Britain. It's sunk by a German U-boat. 1,200 people are killed, more than 1,200, 128 Americans. There's a World War I cartoon, a movie that if you want to watch, it's kind of interesting how they use cartoons to use propaganda. But basically, the Allies are very angry at Germany. This is all over the newspapers. There's all sorts of propaganda about the sinking of the Lusitania. Wilson doesn't want to go to war, though. Teddy Roosevelt calls Wilson a jackass. Henry Cabot Lodge says Wilson is afraid. He flinches in the presence of danger. But Wilson tells America this. He says, "I come from the South, and I know what war is. For I have seen its terrible wreckage and ruin. It is easy for me as president to declare war. I do not have to fight, and neither do the gentlemen on the hill who now clamor for it. It is some poor farmer's boy or the son of some poor widow who will have to do the fighting and dying." So basically, Wilson, because he remembers the Civil War, doesn't want to get America involved. Wilson does send a diplomatic note of protest to Germany. William Jennings Bryan, who had been his Secretary of State, he resigns as Secretary of State because he thinks this note is too harsh towards Germany. You can read the note on slide 67 if you want. Okay, so Wilson has kept us out of war. He runs for re-election in 1916. And his slogan, this is important, is "He kept us out of war." So Wilson runs as the candidate who will keep America out of the war. He has some scandals. His first wife died right as World War I started. Ellen died. He's getting ready to marry a new lady named Edith, and he spends all his time with Edith. And there was kind of this joke during the campaign that Wilson proposed to Edith, and what did she do when he proposed? And then the punchline of the joke is she fell out of bed because it's not appropriate to be in bed together before you're engaged. That's kind of the funny scandal of 1916. But you can see Wilson defeats the Republican Charles Evan Hughes. Doesn't win as many states, but he wins more electoral votes, but he only wins 48%. But Wilson knows that we might get involved in war. So what he does is he starts to prepare America for war. Men volunteered to pretend to be in the army. Up at Plattsburgh, New York, they had kind of these army camps where you could go through what it was like to be a soldier. Some groups fought preparedness. They thought if we get prepared, if we start building up our weapons, building up our military, we'll want to use them. So Jane Addams, the great progressive leader, and the Women's Peace Party gets formed, and they oppose preparedness. What ends up happening is America gets dragged into the war in 1917. The Germans say, we're going to continue our unrestricted submarine warfare. After the Lusitania, Germany backed off. They said, sorry, we won't do that anymore. But by 1917, Germany basically says, the Navy decides we can sink so much shipping that keeps the island of Great Britain alive that we could destroy England, get them out of the war before America could get involved. So they basically take a gamble and decide, let's go ahead and practice submarine warfare. And then the Germans do something else. They send a note. This is called the Zimmermann Note. It's from Arthur Zimmermann, the German Foreign Secretary. And it goes to Mexico, and it basically says, you guys should attack the United States, and when Germany wins the war, Germany will make sure you get back territory you lost to America in the 1840s. Well, Mexico is undergoing revolution, so they can't attack America, and they wouldn't have anyways. And what ends up happening is Wilson says, because of the unrestricted submarine warfare, because of the offer or the plea to get Mexico to attack the United States, we now have to go to war. So in April of 1917, he asks for and Congress declares a declaration of war. This is when Wilson famously says, we are going to fight for idealistic terms. We're going to make the world safe for democracy. And one thing that's kind of important to remember is in February of 1917, the Russian Revolution happened, and this was the non-communist revolution. So in February of 1917, the Tsar is overthrown, and Russia becomes a democracy. So in April, America gets involved. It's America, it's England, it's France, it's Russia, all big democracies against Germany, Austria, the Ottoman Empire. Those are not democracies. Later on, when the Russians have their communist revolution in October of 1917, they're no longer a democracy. But when America declares war, Russia is a democracy. Now, America does not become an ally, they become an associate power. That was Wilson's way of saying, we're going to fight with you guys, England, France, and Russia, but we don't really like your colonialism. We don't really like how you handle affairs. So we're kind of going to fight, but with the right to do it our own way. So I kind of want to talk about the home front, the military front, and then we'll talk about the peace conference. Okay. So America passes the Selective Service Act of 1917. America has a really tiny army for the time. There hasn't been a draft since the Civil War. When we have the draft in 1917, more than 9 million men are drafted into the Army. You have something called the War Industries Board. I'm not going to read all the things they do to you, but basically the War Industries Board regulated the economy for war production. It controlled prices. It separated the separation between business and state is blurred. They intervene in the economy. You have something called the Food Administration. Herbert Hoover, who we'll hear more from later on, he runs the Food Administration. They basically set prices for food. They conserve food. They try to get people not to eat certain food so it can go to Europe. There's a Fuel Administration. There's a Railroad War Board. Basically, the government really gets involved in the economy. World War I and World War II are probably the most centralized the American economy has ever been. There's all kinds of food posters trying to get Americans to eat or not eat certain types of food. If you look at slide 84, you can see that. Food will win the war is a big slogan. There's something called the Committee on Public Information. This is kind of a propaganda committee, but it's also kind of creepy. A man named George Creel oversees the CPI. He's the one that came up with the "He kept us out of war" slogan. Basically, from 1914 until 1917, the government tells Americans, be neutral, don't pick sides, don't get involved in the war. Well, then all of a sudden, in 1917, America goes to war. The government says, you need to be focused on the war. You need to take sides. There's no room for middle ground. You're either with us or you're against us. So the American government, through the CPI, basically wants the American public opinion to do a 180. There's tons of censorship throughout the American media. There's all kinds of people going around spying on their neighbors. There's 4 Minutemen who are supposed to give a 4-minute speech originally between movies, but then later on just on the street corners, trying to get everyone pumped up for the war. There's all kind of pamphlets going out. There's loyalty leaflets. There's all kinds of mass movements to try to get Americans to support the war. If you look at slide 87, there's a really kind of famous poem that a 4-minute man would read. And the idea of having 4 Minutemen is kind of like having Minutemen back in the American Revolution era. There's this goal to have 100% Americanism, no more hyphenated Americans, so no more German, Hungarian, or Irish Americans, just Americans. There's no more German being taught in schools. People stop listening to Beethoven. The Uncle Sam that we all know is created during this time. If you look at slide 90, I've got a picture of it. There's all kinds of movie stars that sell Liberty bonds and try to get Americans to support the war effort. If you look at slide 91, I've got YouTube clips of short movies. These are usually 10 to 20 minutes, basically supporting the war effort. They're pretty cool. If you got some extra time, you should click on some of these. I like The Beast of Berlin. That's a pretty interesting one. There's a war exposition that travels around America. It basically shows off captured war material from Europe. You can eat food like a soldier. You can see wreckage of Zeppelins that have crashed in England that were from Germany. Basically gives you a taste of what's going on in Europe. There's this huge backlash against German Americans. Um, Wilson kind of supported this. You know, he said, "I'm sure the country is honeycombed with German intrigue." There are some explosions in different places in America. There are some German spies that are being funded by the German government. So there is some espionage going on. There's some German newspapers that are trying to get Americans not to support the war. But basically, there's a huge reaction against Germans because this war is now against Germany. Um, there's this kind of weird group that gets formed uh, through kind of the police forces. About 500,000 men and women are photographed because their loyalty is questioned. The CPI publishes articles on how to identify pro-Germans. J. Edgar Hoover, the future director of the FBI, oversees this. There's concentration camps built in case we have to lock up mass number of German Americans. There's something called the American Protective League. Basically, it's kind of this quasi-military force. There's over 250,000 Americans that belong to it. They basically watch out for spies. They enforce loyalty. They intimidate people who don't support the war. They arrest American citizens suspected of disloyalty. Maybe you complain about food rationing. You could get arrested for that. Um, there's these things called slacker raids where basically the APL has these mass raids where they arrest people who they think are not signing up for the draft or draft dodgers. World War I is probably the biggest time that American civil liberties have been threatened and basically like ignored. Now, I would say it's the second. Probably the biggest is if you count segregation. You know what the South and other parts of the country did to blacks, not letting them practice their civil rights like voting or taking part in American life. But beyond that, this is probably the biggest time that this goes on. There's the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act that gets passed. So Congress passes laws basically making dissent illegal. Lots of examples of violation of civil liberties. I've got a list on slide 97. You can kind of read some of those. Um, all kinds of examples of people being arrested for things that aren't even that big of a deal. Eugene Debs, a socialist, he's jailed because he gives an anti-war speech. A man named Charles Schenck is convicted. He sent pamphlets through the mail urging people to dodge a draft. This is considered not okay to do. Women fill all kinds of jobs. They work in munitions factories. They work for the railroads. They work as farmers. They work in the Red Cross as ambulance drivers and nurses. Women protest for the right to vote. We kind of talked about Alice Paul and her National Women's Party, but they protest in front of the White House. You know, Woodrow Wilson, how can you make this a war about democracy when you're denying us the right to vote? Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to take a break because I got to go get some water. But I'll do the second part of this slideshow in the next video.